Good morning. My name is Tony Adamczyk, and I'm here today to give you a presentation on Hitler's World War II Vengeance weapons. First, let's take a look at my 30-year Air Force career. In phase one of my career, I was a B-52D electronic warfare officer. Phase two of my career, I worked at training, headquarters staff, and was a squadron commander at Randolph Air Force Base when we transferred navigator training from Mather Air Force Base to Randolph Air Force Base in 1993. The third part of my career, I was acquisition group commander at Hill Air Force Base and Eglin Air Force Base. I worked training simulators, which included pilot, navigator, threat systems. I worked shelters, generators, bomb transport and training, smart bomb kits, and finally, aerial targets, both full and subscale, which are highly related to what you're going to see today. As you can see, the subscale targets are very similar in looking like the Vengeance weapons from World War II, with the most recent being the BQM-167 is the newest one. One of the more interesting parts was I was involved with converting aircraft from the Air Force Boneyard in Arizona into aerial targets. In other words, piloted drones so they could be shot down as part of testing and training. And the most interesting and the most challenging was converting the F-16s to QF-16s. Before we view the documentary videos, I want to go over some terms and definitions to help make more sense of what you're going to see in the documentary videos. Our first thing we're going to mention will be the Treaty of Versailles. Next, we'll briefly talk about our rocket pioneers that were involved in the rocketry development. We will then move on to Penembau, Germany. From there, we will go on to briefly discuss the German weaponized rockets, which is the main focus of our discussion today. After that, we'll take a look at Operation Hydra and its impact. From there, we'll move on to Metalwork, which was the underground factory, and the Doral concentration camp. We'll then follow with two documentary videos that I put together following from different various clips that I was able to obtain on the website. After the videos, we're going to do a Did You Know session, which brings out some interesting tidbits about the V1 and V2s. We will then conclude with a short discussion on Operation Paperclip. Now let's go over more detail of these terms. First was the Treaty of Versailles. It was a peace treaty that brought World War I to an end. It was signed on June 28, 1919, but became effective on January 10, 1920. The treaty itself was between Germany and three principal allies of France, England, and the United States. However, the United States never ratified the treaty itself. The treaty imposed very harsh penalties on Germany. There were 14 major points. The big parts were reparations, loss of territory, demilitarization, and no improvement in arms, which included tanks, airplanes, ships, and heavy artillery. However, there was a loophole, as that there was no mention of rockets. As such, the post-war German army studied the possibility of using rockets to compensate for the limited amount of heavy artillery allowed by the treaty. Finally, in the 1930s, Germany disregarded the terms, and this led to nationalism, which then led to the rise of Hitler. Our first rocket pioneer that we'll look at was an American by the name of Robert H. Goddard, who was an engineer, physicist, and inventor. Goddard had 214 patented inventions, which included a multi-stage rocket, a liquid-fueled rocket, two-axis control, which were including with the gyroscopes and steerable thrust. Goddard launched his first rocket successfully on March 16, 1926, and he did all his work around Roswell, New Mexico and White Sands Proving Ground. The Germans recognized what he contributed to the rocketry and that they consulted him in the 1920s and the early 1930s. When Goddard was no longer able to work with the Germans, they came over to the United States and went to the patent office and copied his blueprints and patents. And this was confirmed with the capture of the V-2 rockets in 1945. Our next pioneer was a German by the name of Werner von Braun. After World War II, he became an American via Operation Paperclip. Von Braun was a brilliant individual, and that at the age of 22, he received his doctorate in physics, which is today the aerospace engineer. While he was in his 20s and 30s, he was a key component to the Nazi rocket development. He helped design and develop the V-2 rocket, and he had his first successful launch of an A-4, which was the V-2, took place on October 3rd, 1942. Even at an early age, von Braun had dreams of traveling to the moon, to where even in 1930, while he attended a presentation from Auguste Piccard, who was a pioneer of high-altitude balloon flight, stated to him, "You know, I plan on traveling to the moon at some time." There was always some concern about von Braun in that he was a Nazi. However, he had to join the National Socialist Party, the Nazi, in order to fulfill his dream of developing rockets of going to the moon. He ended up being the technical director of the Army Rocket Center at Peenemünde, and after World War II, he ended up becoming an engineer for rockets, NASA, and our Apollo program, which led us to the moon. Now, we'll take a look at Peenemünde, Germany. This was in a secret location in northeast Germany on the Baltic Sea. This map just gives you a feel of where the site was located in relation to Berlin, London, Denmark, there on the northeast portion of Germany on the Baltic Sea. Starting in the mid-1930s, the Germans invested a lot of dollars into this particular site. This complex was built for what would be today equivalent of $10 billion. It became known as Rocket City. The Germans put everything in this one location. They put development, testing, manufacturing, and housing. This would be equivalent in the United States if we were to put together Redstone Arsenal in Alabama, Cape Canaveral in Florida, White Sands Missile Test Range, and a manufacturing facility of Boeing's in St. Louis or the one in Fort Worth of Lockheed Martin, all in one location. Finally, after the Soviets captured the site after the end of World War II, they totally destroyed it. The only thing left was remnants of a power plant. Now we'll take a look at the Vengeance weapons themselves. On 29 September 1943, Albert Speer publicly promised retribution against the mass bombing of German cities by a secret weapon. V weapons, known in original German as Vergaswaffen, which was short or another word for retaliatory weapons or reprisal weapons. Their primary intent was to postpone an Allied invasion. They were going to do this by destroying supply depots, debarkation ports, and troop concentrations in southern England. Failing that, there were three purposes that remain. One was to disrupt invasion at the beachhead, pose a counter threat from France to divert Allied bombing resources from the offense against Nazi industry, and finally to demoralize British civilian population by terror bombing and thereby weaken Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. The first vengeance weapon we'll look at was the V1. It was a pulse jet powered cruise missile. It was low tech. It was considered a stopgap missile, and it had a nickname of being called the Flying Torpedo. This is an actual recording of the buzz bomb or doodlebug in World War II. It sounded like a motorcycle in bad running order. The first V-1 rockets were launched on June 13, 1944. This was 1 week after the D-Day invasion. Only 10 V-1s were launched, but only 4 reached London. Starting on June 15th, they start launching 100 V-1 rockets per day toward England. The V-1s had a limited range, and their aiming point was the Tower of London. Therefore, if they had a headwind, they fell short. If they had a tailwind, they overflew London, so they averaged out in the long run. 9,251 V-1s were fired at Britain. The Brits tried to intercept them by using barrage balloons with wires, artillery fire, and even used aircraft to shoot them down. Of all the V-1 rockets fired, only 2,515 reached the area around London. Here we have the German soldiers towing the V-1 rocket to a launch site, and then some of the aftermath of V-1. And even they have a dedication in London to the very first site that took a V-1 rocket hit on June 13, 1944. Next, we'll take a look at the V-2 rocket, or their official name was A-4. It was a liquid-fueled ballistic missile that could travel faster than the speed of sound. This was the weapons the Germans really wanted. The first V-2 that hit England occurred on September 8, 1944. The Brits were unable to defend against the V-2 attacks because it was supersonic and they were using mobile and fixed systems for the V-2 rocket. The last V-2 attack occurred on March 27, 1945. A total of 1,115 V-2s were fired at Britain. The best defense was a good offense in trying to take out and capture the sites. The next key event in the vengeance weapons development was Operation Hydra. This is where the British ended up bombing Peenemünde. Peenemünde was a secret location. However, due to Polish intelligence, Danish engineers, and smuggled letters from enslaved workers at the site, the British found out about this secret location and development. On April 22, 1943, RAF reconnaissance photos confirmed Peenemünde and what was being developed there, such that on June 29, 1943, Churchill said the following: Peenemünde is beyond range of our radio navigation beams, and we must bomb by moonlight, although the German night fighters will be close at hand and it is too far to send our own. Nevertheless, we must attack it on the heaviest possible scale. The British finally conducted their night bombing on August 17th and 18th of Peenemünde. At the same time, on August 17th, They had a diversionary bombing raid on Berlin. The primary objective was to kill as many personnel involved in the research and development. Secondary was to render the research facilities useless and destroy V-2 weapons. Meanwhile, the British lost 215 aircrews, 40 bombers. They lost 23 of the 40 bombers on the third wave on August 18th. But they also killed 500 and 600 enslaved workers at the site. This caused the prototype V-2 launches to be delayed for about 2 months. The Germans then moved their testing to Poland since the site was compromised, and that testing resumed on October 6, 1943. Production, meanwhile, moved to the Harz Mountains to an underground facility at Mittelwerk. The net effect was the bombing raid of Operation Hydra delayed the V-2 offensive by 2 to 4 months. At Pinamambu, the Germans camouflaged the site when they put false craters around to make it seem like the site was bombed already, especially around the wind tunnel, and they painted the roofs of the remaining buildings to look like they'd been burnt or charred to confuse the British. Next, we'll discuss the Mittelwerk, which was the underground manufacturing facility for the V-1 and V-2 rockets. But we also will talk about is the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp. I never heard about this particular concentration camp until I did this research project. The underground facility was constructed in an abandoned gypsum mine. The Germans used the slave labor from the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp. They used these slaves to construct the site underground and then also do the manufacturing of the V-1 and V-2 rockets. The underground facility consisted of 2 major tunnels that were over a mile long with cross tunnels. Tunnels 1 through 20 were used to make Junker jet and piston engines. Tunnels 21 through 46 were used for V-1 and V-2 production, as well as Highland liquid oxygen generators. On April 3rd and 4th, the RAF bombed barracks in the area. They thought they were German barracks, but it turns out it was the concentration camp. The site itself was captured on April 11th by the 3rd Armored Division of the United States. On May 22nd, we shipped captured V-2s back to the United States. On July 5th of that year, we turned over that area to the Red Army. They in turn demolished the entrances and equipment in mid-1948. Now we're getting into the meat of the presentation. We will look at 2 sets of documentary videos. One was spliced from the History Channel's segments, and the second video is also from the History Channel, but it's about the underground V-2 factory and the Mittelbau Dora concentration camp workers. Enjoy the videos.
Germany's fascination with rockets and the idea of interplanetary travel dated back to the 1920s, when a wave of rocket fever swept through the country. The German army decided to involve itself in rocket research out of its desire to circumvent the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles, which Germany was forced to sign after its defeat in World War I. The treaty imposed severe limits on the armaments Germany could produce, but contained a loophole. It made no mention of rockets. To the German army, this meant that rockets, if developed in secrecy, would be a viable weapon. But building rockets was still predominantly done by civilian enthusiasts.
Our idea was to carry mail from one place on Earth to another one. Particularly in Germany, we have a lot of small islands in the North Sea and even in the Baltic Sea. And in bad weather, of course, you couldn't even send the mailman over there. He didn't want to get on a ship and maybe we get stranded. And of course, if you did it by ship, it took you a week to get your mail there. With the rocket, we had figured out already it would take about half an hour. So it was a big advantage.
During this period, a brilliant young aristocrat named Wernher von Braun became interested in rockets. He'd been obsessed with the idea of space travel ever since his mother had given him a small telescope as a child. Wernher von Braun was actively developing his own rocket designs when he approached the German army for funding. They liked his practical ideas and enthusiasm and offered him a job. He was just 20 years old. In 1932, he began working at the Army Experimental Station under the direction of Colonel Walter Dornberger, the man responsible for Army rocket development. It was the start of a long association that would last for over 30 years. When Adolf Hitler came to power, he poured money into a massive expansion of the armed forces and granted additional funds for the army to build a new rocket research facility. The location chosen for the new site was Peenemünde, an isolated island on the western edge of the Baltic Sea. In 1936, construction crews began turning the forested island into the most modern research center in the world. Peenemünde was an ideal location for a secret rocket base. Heavily forested, it could hide workshops, power plants, and test stands. The whole facility was self-sufficient.
My first impression in Peenemünde was that it was a huge enterprise. The area was great on the island. There was a little railroad connecting the different points. There were big hangars, big halls, big laboratories, manufacturing halls, test stands. It was a very great impression.
Within 3 years, Peenemünde expanded to include shops and living quarters for the community of 4,000 skilled workers living within its perimeter. A railway brought in another 11,000 employees who lived in nearby towns.
The security was very tight, and you normally had to stop at the gate and show your pass. And even the people who came with the railroad, they were normally even checked twice. They were checked once when they got on the railroad, and they were checked again when they finally entered the main area of the facility.
The people working at Peenemünde developed a real sense of community. Its sea and long sandy beaches were ideal for recreation. For 20-year-old mathematician Ruth Kraft, it was a perfect place to work.
It was a very attractive location on the Baltic Sea. This was a dream holiday destination for people from Middle Germany like myself, back in the 30s. I soon sensed that the facility was consciously designed as a kind of ghetto for scientists.
Angelegtes Wissenschaftler-Ghetto.
The German Army's first 2 experimental rockets, designated the A1 and A2, were very small and basic. But the A3, which was 20 feet in length, was a practical research device. Its purpose was to improve the steering by the use of gyroscopes and to develop the thrust of the motor which would propel the missile through the sound barrier. In 1937, encouraged by the success of the A3, the German High Command issued specifications for a new rocket. The missile should have a 200-mile range, a 1-ton warhead, and be transportable by railway. Von Braun came up with the A4 design. But before the A4 combat rocket could become a reality, another test model was developed, the A5. On this new model, fins were added to improve stability. Test launches over the Baltic Sea were encouraging. Werner von Braun, seen here helping to recover a rocket, was to use the A5 as the standard test model until the A4 could be completed. But on the outbreak of war in September 1939, Hitler reduced funding for long-term rocket research.
Hitler had initially not assigned high priority to rocket work. He figured, and maybe in a way he was right, he figured that it would take longer than, in his opinion, the war would last.
Hitler had been present at one of the early rocket tests and was not impressed.
Most people who saw a rocket firing with a lot of noise and a big flame coming out of your rocket engine were really quite impressed. But Hitler just shook his head, turned around and walked away without saying anything. And of course Dornberger and von Braun were quite disappointed.
But Werner von Braun had faith in what was happening at Peenemünde. Given more time, a bigger and more powerful missile would be within his grasp. He feared, however, that time was running out, and without Hitler's support, long-range rocket development in Germany would come to an end. The development of secret weapons at Peenemünde had once again become a priority for Adolf Hitler. 2 years of war had stretched his forces to the limit. By late 1941, Hitler ordered Werner von Braun, Germany's top rocket scientist, to go ahead with production of the A4, the world's first long-range combat rocket. Although Werner von Braun was the technical director of the A4 project, the logistics for its production fell to Walter Dornberger, Peenemunde's military chief. The friendship and common aim of the two men would prove vital to the project. Along with Dornberger, von Braun had assembled a team of brilliant scientists and engineers to produce the A4 rocket. Augusta Frieda was von Braun's secretary in those early years.
Dr. von Braun war ganz léger.
Dr. von Braun was very relaxed, never strict, or the way one imagines a boss to be. In the evenings, we would write down all the results of the tests. We were enthusiastic about the idea and how to put it into effect. We never really thought of it as a weapon. It was always a research project.
Hatte ja die Idee.
Werner von Braun worked tirelessly on the many technical problems of his design.
Dr.
von Braun was obsessed with his idea. Otherwise, he would not have been able to inspire his colleagues the way he did, and they wouldn't have been so devoted to him. He also drew the right people closer to him, and they really worked hard to continue his line of thought.
Den Gedankengang weiter fortgesetzt.
It was always most impressive to listen to him. He was an excellent speaker. He could formulate his ideas very beautifully and convincingly. Von Braun was extremely patient to tell and explain his standpoint and to listen to the other one and to bring forth his arguments, not with overwhelming power or with authority also, but just with technical reason and logic.
The A4 would travel at roughly 4 times the speed of sound, a velocity unheard of at the time. The aerodynamics of the weapon were a critical factor in the early stages.
We had a big wind tunnel at Peenemünde, and we had wind tunnel measurements at various Mach numbers from subsonic to Mach 5, roughly. We were trying to build a supersonic airplane, and that's not that easy.
Und da habe ich erst mal begriffen.
That was when I understood what it means to design and develop a projectile that can go beyond the Mach number, that is supersonic speed. I realized something special was going on there, or something special was being developed.
Stattfand oder entwickelt wurde.
This early filmed diagram shows the technical achievements of the A4. The rocket is driven by the reaction of a jet of high-speed gases produced from the combustion of 9 tons of liquid oxygen and alcohol in the space of 60 seconds. The man responsible for this revolutionary breakthrough in the rocket motor was Dr. Walter Thiel.
Walter Thiel was in a way parallel to von Braun. He was reporting to von Braun, so von Braun was definitely the overall boss, but Thiel had pretty much his own field. He was not really a designer, he was in fact a chemical engineer himself, but he was in charge of the development of the rocket engine.
The capacity of one fuel tank was 4.5 tons of liquid oxygen. Keeping the fuel tanks empty until the launch made the A4 easier to transport. Located above the fuel tanks were 2 gyroscopes which controlled the rocket. These operated the large graphite vanes placed behind the jet to deflect the exhaust gases and so steer the rocket. The first assembled A4 was finally ready for testing by March 1942. It was a spectacular failure. When another test failed, the A4 critics in Berlin wanted the project cancelled. It was costing billions of marks with nothing to show for it. Von Braun was worried.
When the tests failed, he came into his office. Although he was very angry, he kept it to himself. It was terrible for him because each time it was a setback and he couldn't make any progress.
The second launch failed at about that point. So again, many people said, we told you so, you just can't make it. And then fortunately with the third one, which was really the last one which had been permitted by Hitler. Hitler wanted to cancel the whole operation. And he insisted you at least have to show us in one good launch that you can make it, that you can obtain a reasonable distance with your missile.
On October the 23rd, 1942, an improved A4 was fired. Once the 25-ton engine thrust kicked in, the rocket accelerated skyward, breaking through the sound barrier in 40 seconds. Von Braun had made his first major breakthrough.
After a very successful launch, in a big party we had, everyone was drunk. This is the first time that a human-built article has used a part of outer space to get from one place on Earth to another place on Earth. And so that's for me really the beginning of the space age.
But the work at Peenemünde was far from over. Another secret weapon was now being developed that would be the prototype of the modern cruise missile. While rocket scientist Werner von Braun was developing the world's first space rocket at Peenemünde for the German army, the Luftwaffe was planning its own secret weapon. By spring 1942, the war was going badly for the Luftwaffe. Having failed to win the Battle of Britain, its commander-in-chief, Hermann Goering, had lost credibility with Hitler. The second in command of the Luftwaffe was Erhard Milch, a ruthless and ambitious man who before the war had built Lufthansa, Germany's national airline, into one of the world's finest. Hitler liked Milch. The fact that he had a Jewish father did not matter. Milch was determined to restore the Luftwaffe in Hitler's eyes and proposed a new weapon, a flying bomb. Milch maintained that unmanned flying bombs offered numerous advantages over conventional bombing. They were cost-effective, had large payloads, and there was no risk to aircrew. Unlike the rocket, which was taking years to develop, the Luftwaffe wanted a quick solution and decided to adopt the pulse jet engine for its flying bomb, now designated the Fi-103. The early designs showed that the pulse jet was in fact a primitive jet engine that worked on the principle of forcing air through a narrow tube. The FI-103 was launched by placing it on a sled mounted on steel rails on top of a long ramp similar to a ski ramp. A rocket booster then catapulted the flying bomb several hundred miles per hour in a matter of seconds. The Luftwaffe tested the FI-103 at Peenemünde, although this was kept totally separate from the Army's rocket tests. The first flying bomb only flew for 60 seconds and subsequent launches failed miserably. But Hitler saw enough potential in the weapon to let development continue. The FI-103 was in fact the prototype of the modern cruise missile.
Some new feathers here, sir.
The activities on Peenemünde also began to attract the attention of the Allies, especially British intelligence. The British knew the Germans had been working on secret weapons even before the war, but never knew the type of weapons they were. But by 1943, enough intelligence had been gathered for Prime Minister Winston Churchill to take the threat seriously. He established a committee codenamed Crossbow to review all the evidence of German long-range weapons. Top secret reports compiled by British intelligence were taken by special courier to the cabinet war rooms, deep underground in London, where the Crossbow Committee met. The committee was headed by Duncan Sandys, a politician and Churchill's son-in-law. The other leading figure was Lord Cherwell, the British government scientific advisor who strongly argued that the Germans were not capable of building a rocket which would pose a threat to the country. In simple terms, Cherwell believed the solid-fuel rocket would be too large to be a practical proposition, and that any alternative, particularly the use of liquid fuel, was beyond the technology of the time. Sands did not agree. Cherwell insisted that talk of a rocket was a hoax to conceal some other weapon, possibly a flying bomb. Sands, always the shrewd politician, believed the Germans probably had both a rocket and flying bomb, and immediately ordered an increase in aerial reconnaissance missions. A great deal of the evidence for the German long-range weapons had so far been obtained by photographic reconnaissance. Looking for secret weapons was a new field for the photographic interpreters, who had been trained to look for conventional military hardware and movement.
You always checked in case there was something there that wasn't there before. And that's when you found, oh, there's a new road there, or there's a new building there. What's that? So you get out the old cover and look that up. No building. So what are they putting up there? It just worked from checking over and over again.
The breakthrough came when interpreters found a small pilotless aircraft sitting on the end of a firing ramp at Peenemünde. A possible flying bomb. Then, on June the 23rd, 1943, another sortie produced a photograph where a rocket could clearly be seen. The British were stunned. It was now obvious the Germans were planning a rocket attack on Britain. Duncan Sands immediately requested a massive bombing raid on Peenemünde. On the night of August the 17th, 1943, the Royal Air Force amassed 500 heavy bombers to attack Peenemünde. Their mission was not simply to destroy the base, but to kill the scientists and key people whose work threatened England. The raid was launched in complete secrecy. The true nature of the target was not revealed even to the RAF bomber crews. The inhabitants of Peenemünde were used to hearing enemy bombers fly over on their way to bomb Berlin.
We did not take any notice of the sirens wailing. We did not even get out of bed for that, because we were used to reconnaissance planes in the air, but we always thought they would not see us.
High explosive and incendiary bombs began falling. Peenemünde was caught unprepared and soon became a sea of flames.
On that particular night, I remember that very well. We went into the ditches and lay down, and the bombs came. There were a number of hits by bombs in buildings, and fires began to burn. It was a very ghastly situation.
Due to the phosphorus and the air pressure from the bombs, everything, including the debris, the sand, pine needles, were flying around. And then we saw all the bodies lying there, torn to pieces.
Zerfetzte Körper.
A total of 735 people were killed, including many scientists, among them the man responsible for the A4 motor, Dr. Thiel.
Thiel's family, his entire family, was completely wiped out. And there were, of course, a number of other key people, but Thiel was probably the most important man. And in that sense, probably the air raid obtained its objective to kill the German workers so that the work could not continue in Peenemünde.
The raid had severely damaged Peenemünde and set the A4 project back by several critical months. It also prompted the Germans to shift some of their experimental activities to an SS artillery range near the village of Blitzna in Poland, beyond the range of Allied bombers. Despite the setback to the A4 rocket, Hitler's other terror weapon, the deadly flying bomb, was at last ready to be unleashed against the Allies. The devastating RAF raid on the German base at Peenemünde was a serious setback to German rocket development. It had not affected Hitler's new flying bomb. By 1944, these terror weapons were now being secretly transported to their launch sites. A series of aerial reconnaissance missions by the Allies along the French and Belgian coast had identified a number of possible launch sites for long-range weapons against Britain.
Gradually, one was able to build up that there was something going on. So then we managed to plot the whole of that coastline. There must have been over 100 sites, and alarm bells rang because it was much bigger than anybody expected.
And all the sites were pointing to London. On June the 13th, 1944, exactly 1 week after the Allied invasion of Europe had begun, the first German flying bomb was launched across the English Channel. It landed in the East End of London, where it killed 6 people. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels announced to the world that Vergeltungswaffe 1, Vengeance Weapon 1, had been used in retaliation for the Allied invasion of Normandy. The weapon was now known as the V1. Over 3,000 V1s would be launched against London in the next few weeks. The British knew little about the V1. The blind, impersonal nature of the flying bombs made people on the ground feel helpless. There was no human enemy to shoot down.
We did know they were coming because they made a very distinctive sound, and it was a sort of room, 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 and then suddenly it would stop and you just dive for cover wherever you were. There was this terrible silence. It just seemed like the whole world stopped.
The V1s were launched day and night, the 1-ton warhead of high explosives causing enormous damage in built-up areas. Cyril de Man was a chief fire officer at the time.
I was on many a job within minutes before the smoke had gone down. It was horrific, really, and you'd have people, members of the family, or possibly neighbours and people they knew, seeing dismembered bodies laying all over the street, and there were scenes of terrible distress. I saw so much of it that I hardened myself. I couldn't afford to be emotional about it, otherwise I wouldn't have been doing my job.
Nobody escaped the effects of the indiscriminate bombing, although London schoolboys like Tony Moss felt it was an adventure.
I suppose I didn't fully sense the danger, being only about 13 years of age. We got used to them. We even used to go out into the garden and watch these noisy things go over. They sounded like a motorcycle going across the sky. And eventually, of course, they became known as flying bombs and then buzz bombs, and then people nicknamed them the doodle bug.
The British authorities were stunned by the magnitude of the bombardment. It had been difficult to plan how best to defend London against the V1 without knowing the precise nature of the weapon. The main defenses were based on dealing with conventional bombers. Huge gas-filled barrage balloons were erected. Their thick cables were designed to rip the wings off any flying machine that flew into them. They eventually accounted for 232 flying bombs. The anti-aircraft guns found it difficult to stop the smaller, low-flying V1s. The British soon realized the best way to combat the V1 was to concentrate their guns and destroy the flying bombs long before they reached London. Two new American defense weapons were also introduced. A radar system which plotted the course of the flying bombs, giving the gun crews more accuracy, and a new close proximity fuse in the gun shells, which exploded when it was within range of the target, turning a near miss into a hit. The new strategy worked, and V1s were being shot out of the sky at an increasing rate. The Royal Air Force also had considerable success shooting down V1s. They deployed specially adapted Spitfires and the Hawk Tempest, their fastest fighter. However, because of its speed and size, the V1 was a difficult target.
If you saw a flying bomb coming towards you, it was no good saying, oh, I'll get in behind it and shoot it down, because, in fact, you would never have caught it in that way. We had to have an entirely different technique of getting up above them, then diving and with an aileron turn so that we dive virtually on top of them and then flattened out behind them, and then you're in a position to shoot it down.
If you got directly behind it, you had the heat haze from the jet, and all you could see was a couple of wingtips. But you'd pull into about 400 or 500 yards and give it a burst.
If an aircraft ran out of ammunition, some pilots adopted the highly dangerous tactic of tipping the wings of the V1 to send it off course.
I put my port wing underneath the starboard wing of the flying bomb, and I'm afraid that didn't work. It just skidded away from me. And I thought, well, this is no good, so a change of technique. Next time I put my wing under and then immediately flicked my stick over, and the thing just catapulted into the ground, into a wood just outside Sevenoaks.
By the end of August, only one bomb in 7 got through to the London area. It looked as if the V1 had been mastered. Of the 8,000 V1s that were launched against London, 2,400 reached their target. The price of Hitler's terror weapon was high. A total of 24,000 civilians were killed or seriously injured. 750,000 houses were damaged. Although the V1 campaign had failed, a second threat to England now drew near. A silent, deadly missile was about to be hurled at London. 1944, German rocket scientist Werner von Braun and his team had made great strides in rocket technology since their first successful launch of the A4 2 years earlier. Yet problems with the A4's propulsion system meant von Braun was still unable to give Hitler a fully operational combat rocket. In July, the A4 project came under the control of Heinrich Himmler, head of the notorious SS and the second most powerful Nazi in Germany. Von Braun had repeatedly told Himmler the A4 was not ready to use, but Himmler had convinced Hitler that the scientists were being far too cautious in firing Germany's new secret weapon.
It was not yet fully reliable, and it was always a particular effort on von Braun's part to convince Himmler particularly that our rocket is not yet accurate enough and not yet reliable enough to be used as a real good and successful weapon.
When Hitler finally decided to really use it as a weapon and to eventually call it the V2, it was not completely developed. So we should have had an extra 2 or 3 years to do final developments, and then the V2 would have been able to have really a very accurate, a pinpoint missile, which can pick out a building in a city complex or ship at sea.
After the RAF had bombed the original rocket testing site Peenemünde in August 1943, tests of the A4 were also being carried out at an artillery range at Blizna in Poland. The Polish resistance had been keeping a vigilant watch on the activities at Blizna, when during a test flight, an A4 fell from the sky, landing on the banks of the River Bug without exploding. The Poles found the rocket, and before the German recovery team arrived, managed to hide it by rolling it into the water. The Germans, unable to locate the A4, gave up the search. Working under constant threat of discovery, Polish engineers supervised the dismantling of the missile before contacting British intelligence. The British desperately needed technical information about the mysterious A4. And on July the 25th, an RAF Dakota landed on a little used airfield in Poland to collect the components of stolen rocket and take them back to London. This vital new evidence confirmed the destructive potential of the Nazis' long-range rocket. Churchill was deeply worried. With the V1 campaign still raging over London, he decided to keep news of the new deadly weapon from the general public. With luck, the launch sites could be hunted down and destroyed before they could be used. With the collapse of the German forces in France, the Allies would soon reach the borders of the Reich itself. Hitler hoped to counter this threat by unleashing his new secret weapon, and on August the 29th he ordered the A4 offensive to begin. The German army moved its A4 launch crews to The Hague in Holland, which was 200 miles from London, just within the missile's range. The Germans figured the Allies would be reluctant to bomb the Dutch capital, known as the City of Peace. The mobile launchers were hidden in the surrounding woods and then driven out into the open for firing. On September the 8th, 1944, the first A4 was launched against London. It reached a height of about 50 miles before falling at 3,000 miles per hour on its target. The whole flight took no more than 5 minutes. There was no warning.
It came over and came down faster than the speed of sound, so that you heard the explosion from the bomb and then heard it come in a second or two afterwards. And it used to sound rather like a tube train coming into a station.
The Nazi propaganda machine quickly dubbed the A4 the V2, Vengeance Weapon 2. What made the V2 unique among the weapons of World War II was the fact that it could not be intercepted. There was no defense against the rocket once it was in the air. "60 days after the offensive began, the local Woolworths in Deptford, East London, was crowded with shoppers, mostly women and children, when a V2 hit the store.
My school actually was more or less on the corner opposite where the bomb had gone off. It was a very devastating thing. We knew lots of the women that were in the shop. They were neighbours, and I can remember one of their children came into us and said, "Mummy hasn't come home," and actually Mummy never did come home. We didn't know at the time, but it turned out to have been the biggest V2 disaster in Britain.
The shoppers never had a chance. 240 of them were killed or seriously injured. In all, 1,100 V2s struck England, causing over 9,000 casualties. Destruction of property was massive. In London alone, 500,000 houses were destroyed. As the final months of the war drew to a close, the Germans, who had stockpiled thousands of both the deadly V1s and V2s, continued launching their V-weapons. When the launch sites in France and Belgium were overrun by the Allied armies, the Luftwaffe began using bombers to launch V1s. Over 1,000 were fired in this way. Hitler also launched a V-weapon campaign of terror against the Belgian city of Antwerp, in a desperate bid to stop its port being used by the Allies. 9,000 V1s and 1,600 V2s were fired on the city, causing 10,000 casualties. But time had run out for Hitler. The Allied forces were already advancing into the heart of the Third Reich. Yet both the V1 and V2 continued to be launched until 6 weeks before the war's end, on May the 8th, 1945. Although the V-weapons did not win the war for Hitler, they did have an immense effect on Allied resources. They forced the Allies to divert thousands of aircraft, 2,700 guns, and 250,000 troops from frontline duties. After the war, conflicting opinions rose as to how effective the V-weapons had been to the German war effort. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, remarked that if Hitler had succeeded in using the V-weapons against English ports instead of London, the invasion of Normandy might have been written off. On the other hand, Albert Speer, the German Minister of Supply, thought the V2 had done the Germans more harm than the Allies, as the quantity of highly skilled men and scarce raw materials could have produced a large number of jet fighters which would have been decisive in the air war. With the war's end, there was a frantic race between the victors to capture as much information on the V-weapons as they could. The Americans took the V1, renaming it the JB-2, which they planned to launch against Japan. 100 V2s and tons of spare parts were also seized and transported back to the United States. But the victors also wanted the scientists. Werner von Braun made a conscious decision to offer his services to the Americans, and on May the 2nd he surrendered to the American Army. Von Braun and his team of 118 German scientists and engineers went to work for the Americans at the White Sands Proving Grounds in New Mexico, developing guided missiles. Due to their new allegiance, it was considered unwise for them to take pride in the A4 weapon system, which had been used as a means of terror against Allied civilians. In America, Werner von Braun's leadership qualities again shone through, and he was able to return to his original dream of putting men on the moon.
He was a genius as an engineer, as an organizer, as a project planner, as a leader, as a person who could convince others of his ideas.
I think with Werner von Braun we would not have the space program that we have today. We certainly would not have been on the moon, and we probably would not have an international space station going around the Earth today.
Werner von Braun had begun his career with the top secret rocket, but his dream was realized when in 1969 the Apollo spacecraft landed men on the moon. It was just 27 years after the first successful launch of the A4 at Peenemünde.
In the days after the attack, Armaments Minister Albert Speer and Reich leader of the SS Heinrich Himmler joined Hitler in emergency meetings. Himmler suggested moving V2 production underground. A location was chosen: a petroleum storage facility 220 miles southwest of Peenemünde, near the center of the country. The future of the German rocket program, and perhaps of Germany itself, would reside in the tunnel complex near the town of Nordhausen. The Nazis became interested in the Nordhausen area 7 years earlier, in 1936. When a government agency decided to build a large underground storage facility for oil and strategic materials in preparation for war. A site was chosen near Nordhausen at Kohnstein Mountain. Anhydrite, used for making fertilizer and explosives, was already being mined there. The soft rock was good for tunneling, yet required minimal supports. In June of 1936, 400 miners went to work on the first stage of the project. The final plans called for 2 parallel main tunnels that would stretch over a mile through the mountain. Barrels of petroleum would be stored in cross tunnels or galleries, connecting the 2 main tunnels like the rungs of a ladder. Over the next 7 years, miners excavated millions of tons of rock. By 1943, most of the tunnels were complete and held 4 million gallons of oil, the largest cache in the country. But after the bombing at Peenemünde, Hitler allowed the transformation of the nearly completed oil depot into a rocket factory. Mass assembly would shift from Peenemünde to Nordhausen. But von Braun, the technical director of rocket development, would stay at Peenemünde, working on other missile projects and improving the V2. Himmler, eager to become a bigger player in the rocket division, offered more concentration camp labor to build the factory and later assemble rockets.
Himmler names Hans Kammler as his chief for this V2 production. Hans Kammler was the chief of SS construction, and as such had been involved in building the Auschwitz gas chamber crematoria complex, and he was known as a real striver, as an incredibly ambitious, forceful individual.
Kammler's challenge was to turn a series of damp and dirty tunnels into a factory. His first task was to finish tunneling. On August 28, 1943, the first 107 concentration camp prisoners arrived at Nordhausen, soon joined by thousands more. But there weren't even barracks for the mostly Russian, Polish, and French prisoners and captured resistance fighters.
For 6 months, we lived in this tunnel with the same clothes, pair of pants, a shirt, and a jacket, without a shower. We couldn't even drink when we were caught drinking, except 1 cup of water a day. We used to be beaten. For 6 months, we never saw daylight. There was not even bunks where we could sleep, so we had to sleep on the floor wherever we could.
Conditions were brutal. Blasting went on 24 hours a day. Thick dust filled the air. Prisoners worked in 12-hour shifts. But the blasting deprived them of sleep even when they weren't working. There were no toilets, no showers. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and dysentery were rampant. By Christmas 1943, over 10,000 men were working in the tunnels, digging and loading rocks into rail carts by hand, drilling ventilation shafts, installing lighting, removing oil barrels, laying train track, and installing machinery. After 7 months, slave laborers finished digging the tunnels and enlarging several galleries, adding more than 135,000 square feet to the size of the factory. Of the thousands of workers who went into the tunnels, 3,000 died during the expansion, victims of overwork, malnutrition, and disease.
The Nazi leadership had convinced themselves that this was a secret weapon which could change the course of the war. The lives of the prisoners meant nothing.
After tunneling, prisoners poured concrete for a level foundation.
Sometimes it happened that some prisoners which were unfit to work further on, they fell down and they were filled with concrete. So the tunnel system is not only a memorial, it is a cemetery.
While many prisoners expanded the tunnel complex, others constructed concentration camp Dora. Although the prisoners living in the tunnels eventually would have barracks to sleep in, this was little consolation for the thousands living on the brink of death. To rid the camp of dead bodies, sacrificed to build Hitler's rocket, the SS installed a crematorium at Dora. But before the crematorium was operational, thousands of bodies were shipped to Camp Buchenwald. Seeing the arriving cargo, Buchenwald prisoners surmised the only thing Dora produced was corpses. As bodies left Dora, trainloads of equipment from Peenemünde and other factories started arriving. By late 1943, Germany was desperate. Hitler clung to the hope that the tunnels near Nordhausen would produce a miracle. Nearly 2 slave laborers died for each of the 6,000 V-2 rockets that were produced in the Mittelwerk factory near Nordhausen. The V-2 rocket factory will return on Modern Marvels. With the threat of an Allied invasion looming, it became all important to get the Nordhausen V-2 factory operational. Slave laborers were forced to ready the Nordhausen factory for mass production, installing presses, welders, drills, lathes, and other manufacturing tools. V-2 assembly would take place in the Mittelwerk, or Central Works. By January 1944, in less than 4 months, the factory produced its first 50 V-2s. But 50 rockets wouldn't win the war. Hitler wanted thousands of V-2s. The factory was expected to manufacture 900 a month. To try and meet this unrealistic goal, Arthur Rudolph, the former assembly manager at Peenemünde, was put in charge of the Mittelwerk production at Nordhausen.
He was responsible for ensuring that the V-2s were produced, ensuring that the components came that were of adequate quality, and that the assembly process ran on time.
While Rudolph set up the assembly factory at Nordhausen, Werner von Braun remained at Peenemünde, refining the V-2. However, he made several trips to see the factory's progress. Once established, Rudolph's assembly line used 5,000 forced laborers and 3,000 German civilians, who were not supposed to consort with the prisoners. These propaganda photos, taken to illustrate the efficiency of forced labor, are the only known existing images taken during manufacturing.
I think that they don't show the reality. They show a clean factory, and in reality the prisoners had nearly nothing. They had no shoes. The clothing was very bad. But on the photos you can see very fit prisoners, which obviously had enough to eat, and you can see clean production lines, and it's not the reality of Mittelwerk.
17,000 different parts went into each V-2 rocket. Most components, such as the propulsion unit and guidance system, came from other factories as sub-assemblies. Parts came in via rail line or on the backs of prisoners through Tunnel A. Then were stored in the cross galleries. Rocket assembly took place in Main Tunnel B, beginning around Hall 21 with the two large liquid oxygen and alcohol fuel tanks, covered by a sheet metal skin. Next came the propulsion subassembly with combustion chamber and turbopumps. Workers then attached the big tail section with fins and jet vanes. Lastly, the guidance section was fitted to the front. In Hall 39, the rocket was galvanized and painted in camouflage colors to avoid being spotted from the air during transport. At the very end of assembly, the rockets reached Hall 41, where an overhead crane lifted them upright for gyroscopic testing and other analysis. Scaffolding in this, the tallest gallery, also allowed engineers to inspect each rocket. SS and Army guards used brutal tactics to keep order, but they had help. Directly supervising the laborers were capos. Capos weren't political prisoners, but often German convicts, who received special treatment for managing the line.
The punishment often is hanging or beating. Beating was constantly. Capo were always beating us. Capo were always behind us. They wanted to impress the SS, so they were beating us constantly.
Production gradually increased from 50 V-2s in January 1944 to 437 per month by May. But the rocket rushed into production had many problems at the launch pad.
Most failed V-2s that came out of this plant were mostly because it was such a complicated weapon. There were many things that could go wrong, many ways for it to fail. But there was prisoner sabotage.
I was French. Some other were Russians, some other were Poles. And nobody wanted Germany to win the war. So we tried sabotage.
Yves Bayon, a welder on the assembly line, risked his life by making shoddy welds on internal sections.
The Russians, they're completely mad. Completely mad. They pissed on machines, for instance. So when they were caught like that, they were hanged. The following Sunday, on the Rolko Square, we didn't have any football place, so instead of football, we had the hanging.
By the spring of 1944, the Mittelwerk was producing around 400 rockets a month, 13 per day. Within months, Allied bombing raids on key industrial plants also forced V-1 and jet engine production into the Nordhausen complex. By September 8, 1944, Germany finally had enough V-2 rockets to launch the first wave against London and recently liberated Paris. It seemed like Hitler's last hope. The weapon terrorized war-weary London. Unlike the V-1, which made plenty of noise, the V-2 gave no advanced warning when it fell out of the sky. Over the next 8 months, Germany launched 4,300 V-2s on Allied targets. Hitler dreamed it would win the war, but expectation far exceeded performance. The V-2 was never as accurate as the Army wished. While V-2s did kill 5,000 people, they never posed enough of a threat to turn the tide of the war.
The V-2 could only carry a 1-ton warhead, and therefore its effectiveness as a weapon was limited. But as a technological breakthrough, it was an astounding transformation.
Although Germany produced nearly 6,000 V-2s, the numbers are misleading. The Mittelwerk factory near Nordhausen never in fact met production quotas, and a high percentage of those built were flawed.
I think that the efficiency of the Mittelwerk was a part of the illusion of the rocket engineers, who thought that it was possible to construct a rocket weapon for the so-called Endsieg, the final victory.
The Mittelwerk continued assembling V-2s even as the Allies advanced to within miles of the plant. Finally, around April 5th, managers abandoned the factory and evacuated the healthy prisoners from Camp Dora. When the U.S. 3rd Armored Division entered Dora and a subcamp in Nordhausen on April 11th, they made a gruesome discovery. Thousands of corpses, victims of disease and malnutrition. Some had been machine-gunned by the SS, but many were the victims of an RAF bombing raid on Nordhausen. About 600 prisoners, too sick to move, were left behind when the plant managers fled. When the Allies arrived, the war was finally over for prisoners who remained at Dora.
There is no feeling. I laid on the floor and kissed the ground. I still get emotional. We survived.
Alex Baum was one of the lucky ones. He escaped in the chaos of evacuation. But the Dora camp system consumed the lives of 25,000 prisoners, worked to death, starved to death, executed. Although the U.S. Army controlled the Mittelwerk, the role of the Nordhausen factory was far from over. The secrets kept underground would affect the entire world in the next decade and change the course of warfare altogether. At a range of 150 miles, the V-2 was designed to land within 1/2 mile of its target. In reality, the accuracy was closer to 10 to 20 miles, and that was only 50% of the time.
I hope you enjoyed the videos. Now we're going to enter the last phase of the presentation, in which I will present to you with some interesting tidbits about the vengeance weapons. Did you know the Germans developed a piloted V-1 rocket? The official name was Pfeiffer V-103R, codename Richenberg. It was available for testing and production in the summer of 1944. To man the V-1s, the Germans created a suicide squadron called the Leonis Squadron. Volunteers had to sign a statement that stated, "I hereby voluntarily apply to be enrolled in the suicide group as part of a human glider bomb. I fully understand that employment in this capacity will entail my own death." The piloted V-1 rocket was launched either from rails or dropped from an airplane. From the airplane, it was the Heinkel HE-11 bomber that could carry either one or two systems. The cockpit was only with basic instruments and a plywood bucket seat. They hardened the wing edges to cut the barrage balloon cables, and the pilots had less than a 1% chance of a successful bailout. The piloted V-1 rocket program project was shelved in October of 1944. It was finally determined suicide missions were not part of a German warrior tradition. Next, did you know the Germans were developing V-1s and V-2s for submarines? V-1s were tested on submarines. They were small and had removable wings so they could fit inside the submarine. However, the launch rails were the problem. They had to surface for an extended time, which exposed the submarine. V-2s were not successful on submarines, but the concept was viable. V-2s were just too large and the fuel was very volatile. It also required a fuel mixture that then had to be uploaded before it could be launched, and they had to be on surface for an extended time again. British intel and a captured spy in Maine had reported that 9 submarines were launched from a Norwegian submarine pen in the spring of 1945. The report said they were headed for New York City to hit it with V-1 rockets. The U.S. had put out an all-out effort to locate and sink the subs. They were able to sink 5 submarines, and 4 of them surrendered in May of 1945 when the war ended. In all of this, no V-1s were launched against New York City. Did you know the British government concealed the V-2 attacks? The British government initially attempted to conceal the cause of the explosions by blaming them on defective gas mains. The first V-2 attack on September 8, 1944 was at Chiswick. After that, the public began referring to the V-2s as flying gas pipes. The Germans themselves finally announced the V-2 attacks on England on November 8, 1944. Finally, 2 months after the initial attack on September 8, on November 10, 1944, did Winston Churchill inform Parliament and the world that England actually had been under V-2 rocket attack for the last few weeks. Did you know that the Vengeance weapons programs had some interesting major setbacks? Initially, the program had very high priority with Hitler. Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 and the rapid success of the Blitzkrieg caused Hitler to reconsider the funding priority. They were winning the war without using rockets, so therefore the funding was applied elsewhere. However, funding was ramped up again for the Vengeance programs in late 1941 after the Russian invasion stalled and the U.S. entered the war. One of the more interesting setbacks was the program was halted in March 1943 due to a Hitler dream. He dreamed that the rockets would never reach England and therefore canceled the program. It took him 3 months to convince Hitler to reverse that decision. One of the main things that impacted the program was strategic bombing took a toll on the industry and transportation of Germany. In addition, Operation Hydra, the bombing of Peenemünde, impacted the program by 3 months and when they had to shift the testing and the manufacturing. Did you know that the V-2 had some major flaws? It was a mobile system that could not be pre-fueled. It had to be in the upright position, then had to have the fuel mix, then the fuel to be uploaded. The accuracy was not very good for the V-2. It needed luck to hit the targets. In addition, the British had a ruse that the V-2s were overflying London by 10 to 20 miles that they reported. The Germans then recalibrated their systems, then landed around Kent, a less populated area. Next, the warhead did not explode until it penetrated the Earth. This was a prelude to our current bucket buster. For example, one explosion at 1226 on the 25th of November 1944 at a Woolworths department store in New Cross, southeast London. 160 people were killed and 108 seriously injured when the V2 penetrated and hit the underground tunnels, which then caused the buildings to collapse. One of the biggest problems of the V2 is that it consumed a third of Germany's fuel alcohol production. To distill the fuel alcohol for one V2 launch required 30 tons of potatoes at a time when food was becoming scarce in Germany. Did you know more V2s were launched against Belgium versus England? Here is a chart that shows where all the V2s were targeted. You see Belgium had 1,664, while the United Kingdom only had 1,400 shot at it. How Antwerp 1,610 and London was at 1,358. The largest loss of life by a single V2 rocket during the war occurred on December 16, 1944, when a V2 hit the roof of a crowded Cinemax Rex theater, leaving 567 dead and 291 injured soldiers in Antwerp, and this was during the Battle of the Bulge. Nearly all were British soldiers. Did you know Hitler was reluctant to use chemical weapons with the V1s and V2s? Hitler was not afraid to use chemical agents, as he used the Xylon B in gas chambers at the concentration camps. The Nazis did produce 12,000 tons of sarin gas, enough to kill millions of people. Sarin gas was developed by accident in 1938 as a chemist who was trying to develop a pesticide to kill weevils in the German fields and orchards. High-level military officers constantly pressed Hitler to use sarin gas. There were three major reasons why Hitler declined the use of chemical weapons against Allied powers. One, he did not want to contaminate the captured area for his soldiers, but his personal experience in World War II was another major factor. Germany was the first to use chlorine gas on the French at Ypres in April 1915. From there, the Allies retaliated. Hitler was hit with mustard gas on October 13th and 14th in 1918, where he was nearly blinded. The third factor was in February 1943, Churchill let the world know that if Germans uses gas, we shall retaliate by drenching the German cities with gas on the largest scale possible. Even so, Nazi factories secretly stockpiled munitions packed with a deadly nerve agent and had it ready to be put in V1s and V2s. Did you know the Germans were developing an intercontinental rocket? When sorting through the documents at the captured site of Middlework in 1945, the Americans found a projected A9-A10 intercontinental missile blueprints. It had a projected range of over 3,000 nautical miles. The nickname was New Yorker. The final area we'll talk about today is a program called Operation Paperclip. This is a very complex, and a whole briefing and presentation can be conducted just on this topic. It was a secret program started in 1945 in which more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were taken from Germany and moved to the United States. The picture you see on the slide, it was for Werner von Braun and his V2 rocket team at Fort Bliss in 1947. The Soviets had a program similar, from which they forcibly moved 2,200 specialists from the captured Germany to Russia. To determine who to move, the Americans found a list in one of the bunkers called the Ausenberg list, and it was a list of key German scientists. The area in purple on the map is the area that the U.S. Army captured during World War II. However, after the war, it was agreed that this area would be turned over to the Soviets to become part of East Germany. As such, the U.S. instigated evacuation operation of scientists from Saxony and Thuringia. On Friday, June 22nd, 1945, at the Bitterfield Town Square, all scientists were to meet to bring their family and easily carried positions for transport to the United States. The Americans were more interested in the work that the scientists did, and they kind of overlooked the Nazi backgrounds. We turned a blind eye to the point that relatively few faced war crimes. We wanted their scientific minds instead. This concludes our presentation today on Hitler's vengeance weapons. This was a little bit lengthy presentation compared to the normal one you receive on our Thursday mornings, but I thought it was interesting with the video clips and the amount of information available. Hopefully you have a takeaway of some new information that you did not know about World War II. Thank you for your participation today. Are there any questions?